Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and explore the fascinating origins of human civilization's absolute most crucial tool. I'm talking about the written word. We use writing every single day, barely giving a second thought to how this incredible technology actually began. But long before the alphabet, long before ink and paper, there was a literal spark of ingenuity in the ancient Near East that changed humanity forever. Today, we are going to unpack the oldest known story about how writing actually came to be.
So who actually invented writing? Now, you might be picturing some ancient accountant tallying up sheep, or maybe a scholar quietly studying in a dusty library. But the oldest recorded story about this world-altering invention doesn't feature either of those. Instead, the ancient Sumerians attributed it to an epic, high-stakes political rivalry. When we think of the first writing, we usually picture a very dry, administrative process. But the literature of ancient Mesopotamia paints a picture full of magic, geographical standoffs, and a clash of massive egos.
Section 1. Who was Enmerkar? To really grasp this ancient mystery, we have to look at the timeline of our main character, Enmerkar, the legendary builder of the great city of Uruk. The traditions surrounding him trace all the way back to the Gemdit Nazard period, somewhere between 3100 and 2900 BC. Historians estimate that if he was a real, historical king, he likely reigned over Uruk around 2750 BC. But here's the crazy part. Notice how the grand stories of his life, the epic poems that detail his incredible deeds, were actually written down hundreds of years after he supposedly ruled, specifically during the Third period.
And over those centuries, the historical king became something much, much larger than life. Get this. Ancient texts, like the Sumerian king list, attribute an impossible 420-year reign to him. Some copies of the list even say he ruled for 900 years. This clearly elevated him from a mere mortal king to a mythological titan. He was remembered not just as a ruler, but as the foundational hero who built Uruk, brought agriculture to the people alongside his wife, and basically established civilization itself.
Which brings us to Section 2, a battle of wits. Our story really takes off when Enmerkar decides he wants to deck out his great temples, specifically the Inanna sanctuary in Uruk and the Abzu temple in Eridu, with precious metals and stones. He realizes that the wealthy legendary city of Aratta, located far away behind 7 mountain ranges, has exactly the materials he needs. This sparks a high-stakes diplomatic chess match. Enmerkar demands tribute, claiming the great goddess Inanna favors him. However, the unnamed Lord of Aratta flatly refuses to submit, boldly claiming that Inanna chose him for power. It's essentially a divine popularity contest, and neither king is willing to back down. Now, instead of just saying no, the Lord of Aratta decides to test Enmerkar. He sends back 3 seemingly impossible riddles for Enmerkar to solve. First, Enmerkar must send grain to Aratta, but he has to transport it in open nets rather than standard bags. Second, he must produce a royal scepter made of absolutely no existing material. And finally, Enmerkar must bring a dog of no known color to fight Aratta's own champion dog. If Enmerkar fails, he loses the entire standoff. But Enmerkar, he totally outsmarts the Lord of Aratta at his own game, with these brilliant, almost MacGyver-style solutions. To transport the grain in nets, he uses sprouting barley. The sprouts interlock and close the gaps in the netting so nothing spills. For the scepter, he whips up a glue-like plastic substance, pours it into a hollow reed, lets it harden, and then breaks the reed mold away, creating a scepter made of a completely synthetic, newly invented material. And for the dog of no known color, he cleverly weaves a highly unique multicolored cloth that leaves the Lord of Aratta completely baffled. Moving on to Section 3, the clay tablet solution. Okay, so solving those riddles wasn't quite enough. The kings still had to negotiate. Picture how this is happening. Enmerkar is sending a herald back and forth across the treacherous mountains of Suzin and Anshan. In this ancient game of telephone, the messages are getting longer, the threats are getting more specific, and the riddles are getting way more complicated. Eventually, the poor messenger's memory reaches its absolute limit. He simply cannot remember the sprawling, complex message Enmerkar wants him to deliver. And here is the absolute moment of creation. The epic text actually tells us, and I quote, because the messenger's mouth was heavy and he couldn't repeat the message, the Lord of Kulaba, that's Enmerkar, patted some clay and put words on it, like a tablet. Until then, there had been no putting words on clay. Out of pure administrative frustration, Enmerkar physically presses words into a piece of wet clay. That makes this the earliest known story in all of human history about the invention of writing. When the herald finally arrives and hands over this newly invented clay tablet, the king of Aratta is just thrown into despair. He stares at the clay, utterly intimidated by this alien technology that Uruk now wields. Suddenly, the storm god Ishkor intervenes, causing a great rain that spontaneously brings forth wild wheat and chickpeas for Aratta. Now, this temporarily bolsters the Lord of Aratta's confidence, but ultimately the new technology of writing tips the scales. It leads to an ending where Uruk seems to triumph, and Aratta is forced to provide the tribute.
Section 4. Ancient political propaganda.
Now we have to take a step back from the myth and ask, did a king named Enmerkar actually invent cuneiform writing in a single afternoon? Well, historians say almost certainly not. These epic poems are part of a collection known as the Matter of Aratta, which originated hundreds of years later during the Ur III period, between 2112 and 2004 BC. They weren't meant to be objective history. They were actually a carefully crafted political movement by the third dynasty of Ur. The kings of this later dynasty wanted to consolidate their own power by claiming to be the legitimate spiritual heirs of Uruk's glorious mythical past. Basically, by elevating Enmerkar, they elevated themselves.
So, taking the story of Enmerkar inventing writing literally completely misses the ideological goal of the authors. Assyriologist Dina Katz points out that treating this as a historical record actually weakens the true purpose of the narrative. It's a political and ethnic statement. It's saying, we, the people of Sumer, are so advanced, so divinely favored, that our founding father invented the very concept of recording human thought just to show up a rival king.
Finally, Section 5. The Tower of Babel connection.
Historians have noticed some incredible parallels between this Enmerkar myth and the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. Think about it. Enmerkar is the great builder of Uruk. In the Bible, a figure named Nimrod is the builder of Erech, which is literally the Hebrew word for Uruk. The suffix kar in Enmerkar's name translates to hunter, while Nimrod is famously called a mighty hunter. Even more fascinating, the Enmerkar epic features a spell called the Incantation of Nudimmud, which asks the gods to either unite or confound the languages of all mankind. That is an undeniable parallel to the confusion of tongues at the Tower of Babel.
And historian David Rohl takes us a step further. He theorizes that Eridu, the very city where Enmerkar was expanding the Abzu temple, is actually the original historical site of Babel. Rohl suggests that the massive, incomplete ziggurat found in the ruins of Eridu is what inspired the famous biblical story of the tower in the first place. Now, we are simply looking at these fascinating parallels noted by historians, but they brilliantly show how deeply these ancient motifs of great builders, divine favor, and the power of language echo across different cultures. So I'm going to leave you with this thought to ponder. Does it really matter if Enmerkar physically pressed that first reed into clay? Or does the true power of this epic lie in how beautifully the invention of writing was weaponized to build the myth of an empire? Writing allowed these ancient kings to cement their legacies, to project their power across mountains, and to ensure we are still talking about them over 5,000 years later. Perhaps the greatest legacy of Enmerkar isn't just the physical clay tablet, but the realization that whoever controls the narrative controls history. What do you think? Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer, and keep questioning the origins of the world around you.